Well, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Creator Interview Roundtable, Ancient Inspirations, New Fiction. I'll introduce myself first, and then I'll just let my fellow panelists introduce themselves. And then I thought what we could do is just kind of, after we've introduced ourselves, talk about our creative process, how Antiquity influences our creative work. And then we can sort of branch out from there and let the discussion be more organic. And then once we sort of have laid the groundwork, we can maybe take some questions from the audience. Maybe if other people have their own creative processes that they'd like to share, we'd love to hear that too. So if that sounds good to everyone, I'll start. My name is Thomas J. West III, but you can just call me TJ. The other is very pretentious, I know. I received my PhD in film and television studies at Syracuse a few years ago, writing about the epic of the mid-century, so Ben-Hur, Spartacus, and so forth. But since then, I've kind of branched out on an alt-ac track. I'm now a full-time freelance writer, writing mostly about film and television and various avenues. So you can check out my work at like Screen Rant. I have my own Substack newsletter. I have a couple of podcasts that I run. So some of my friends here have referred to it as my multimedia empire. So I'm happy to share links about all of that. So I write about a large number of things. But obviously, my first love has always been fiction, surprisingly enough. And I'm at work on a number of projects that are in various stages of completion, all of which have at least some influence of Antiquity. My sort of large-scale epic project is a sort of fantastic reimagining of the late Roman/Byzantine and Persian wars, inflected with a little bit of atomic technology and sort of cosmological conflict. So, the usual epic fare. And then my current project, though, the one that I'm hoping to submit to a publisher for an open call next month, is called The Philippian Chronicle, which is, I call it an erotic epic fantasy. So it's along the lines of, if any of you have read the Cushiel series by Jacqueline Carey. So it does involve actually explicit sex, but it's more than that. It's about desire and how desire shapes history and the unfolding of destiny. So that's what I'm currently working on. And even there, Antiquity makes its mark, because the sort of dogmatic theocratic organization is roughly based on the Byzantine Empire. My co-writer said, I'll give you one Byzantine stand-in that you can use, and that's it. So I could shape my theocratic organization around the Byzantines. So that's how Antiquity, both in terms of settings and locations and cultures, but also the formats of epic and character and storytelling really do shape and have been really pivotal to my growth as a fiction writer, as aspiring fiction writer. Anyway, so Bev, do you want to go next, and then we can move to Amanda?
Oh, okay. All right. Well, tough to follow that. Wow. Okay. Yep. My name is Beverly J. Graf. Pen name for the science fiction side, I'm using BJ Graf. And I'm not sure whether I'll keep that for the fantasy side. We'll see what happens with that. On background, my BA and my MA and doctorate are all in classics. Undergraduate was Dartmouth College and graduate was Princeton University. And then I took an alternative path as well, like TJ. I went to work in the film industry and became a VP of development, which you probably know, but it's a little different from outside of the industry there. You're always looking for material to make into films and television programs in our case. And I worked in the film industry for, I don't know, about 15 years, something like that. So a lot of projects that we worked on. Film at Abilene Pictures is where I ended up and spent the longest time when I was in the film industry. We did a lot of films like Primal Fear and Fracture and Fallen and Frequency, and some TV programs came off of NYPD Blue into NYPD 2069 and some different kind of sci-fi things. Anyways, then I started going back and teaching as well, and now I'm teaching classical mythology and film and TV studies. I'm an adjunct professor at a variety of different campuses, so a different kind of road scholar, I guess you would say, driving all around Los Angeles. And I've started writing. Again, I so now at this point, I have 5 short stories published and 1 novel. Have the one sheet in the back, but just in case. Yeah, Genesis X, my near future sci-fi mystery, and it's basically sort of a riff on the Oedipus myth, I would say. And I always thought it would be fun to take that whole sense of Oedipus's journey and the contemporary conception and preoccupation with fate and free will and all that, and put it into a noir story. I was always thinking of something like, I know Dennis Lehane had that wonderful comment that in mythology, they fall from the heights, right? And in noir, they fall from the curb. And I thought it would be a great idea to have a character who sort of has both, and bring in the notion of a different kind of plague. There's an Alzheimer's that's affecting young people, which is the thing that most terrifies me if I was to come up with something like that. So doing that. And most of my short stories, as TJ mentioned with his writing, most of them also deal with something, some kind of riff on classical mythology. There's one on the Medea called Deus Ex Machina, and some of the others are, likewise focused on mythology and projecting them into different settings and different ways. And it's funny, TJ, we're kind of on parallel tracks, I think. I am at work on an epic fantasy, mine set in the late Bronze Age. So I wanted to take from the end of the Trojan War to basically the end of the Mycenaean period, and what happens, what really was involved with that kind of standard question, and also take some of the great, incredibly dysfunctional families and get into the politics and the dysfunction and the strong female characters, and see what's going on there with Clytemnestra and Helen and Penelope, since they are, of course, sisters and cousins. And I thought there's a lot more that we could get into with that, and then their relationships with the very famous men and all. So enough about me in terms of that. My agent has the first book of that and is going out with it. And fingers crossed, candles lit.
Right.
So.
Amanda?
So hi everyone. I'm finding there's a little bit of a delay on the listening, so hopefully everybody can hear me okay. But if you've got a delay, I'll drop out and pop back in. Everybody's nodding. That's good. Good to see some familiar faces on here tonight. So lovely. And so I guess I've also taken an alternative route. So I did my first degree and my master's and my PhD while working full time in banking and finance, where I still work now, because I need something to pay the bills. And I've always been really interested in creative writing, but it's very difficult doing a very busy job and doing an academic kind of unpaid career and writing creatively. And I'd had an idea for a while for a novel, and so I had the opening line for it and I wanted to get on with it. And the idea was that 2020 was going to be the year that I wrote it. I would not do any academic work for quite a few months while I wrote this down. So this was me. I remember having this conversation with various people that the first line was, Nausicaa stepped out from the pages of the book. And the idea was I wanted to reinvent Nausicaa because I think she's so underutilized in the Odyssey, and take her into so she appears out of the book, which is written which is an English translation of the Odyssey, in a bookshop in Brighton, and she turns up and meets a geeky schoolgirl, and they go out to understand what the monsters really were and find out who Odysseus really was, and a lot of different things together. So it's kind of a teen fantasy, really. And so I had this idea starting with that first line, and I'm friends with Caroline Lawrence, the children's writer. So I remember it really clearly that at the end of February in 2020, I was sitting in the British Museum cafe with Caroline talking about how I was booking 3 days off work as holiday so that I could have 5 days writing time to kickstart it. And then the 3 days came, and it was the first week of lockdown for COVID. So this really fast forwarded my writing, because every weekend I could write because I couldn't go and do anything else. So I was working during the week, very busy, because we had the furlough scheme in the UK, and I was in charge of working on payment holidays for personal customers for mortgages and stuff. So I was mega busy during the week, but at weekends, this is all I did. So I wrote it massively fast compared to the first draft. And then I always thought I'd self-publish. self-publish. And then I sent to a few colleagues and friends read it, and they really loved it. So I thought I'd try and find myself an agent. But I had some really good feedback, but nobody would take it on because it was a bit niche and various other things. And to be honest, then I'd started thinking I would self-publish. So I self-published, and I'm trying to raise money for a charity in Brighton for homeless young people by selling the ebook. So that was the idea behind it. And what I mean, I'll talk about writing process later, but then I hadn't finished with the characters. So I'm just refining the second draft of the sequel, which is Emily's Argonautica, which is the opposite way round. So we have Emily, the geeky schoolgirl from Brighton, becomes Atalanta on the Argo and has to go and steal the golden fleece for Persephone, who's kept Nausicaa prisoner in the underworld. And it's been actually, I think that this is a better book. The second book is a better book. My third book might be an amazing book, and I might go through the agent thing again, but the idea is I'll self-publish this one as well. And for me, it's just been the great process and getting me through COVID lockdown as well. And just amazing that I found, writing's like reading, but so much better. So, that's kind of my experience of doing this. And I've loved it. And I've been running a few online creative writing workshops because I've really enjoyed doing that too. So I think it's one of the good things that come out of COVID was allowing me the time to do this alongside everything else. So yeah, so that's me.
Okay, great. This is fascinating. I love hearing from other creative people. I mean, I'm kind of in a bubble. I live in rural Maryland, so I don't really encounter a lot of other creatives. So this is very exciting. So I thought maybe we could just sort of jump off from there. And one of the things one of the questions, I guess, that motivates me is like, why do we as writers, creative writers, reach back to antiquity in particular? Like, what is it about the ancient world writ large that is so appealing to us as creators? Like, I understand why it's appealing to maybe viewers or readers, but can we maybe also sort of talk about why it is that we still feel ourselves kind of magnetically drawn to the ancient past and when we engage with our creative projects? I'm happy to go first. But you guys, if you want to jump in, that's fine. Like, it doesn't matter.
You go ahead and go first, TJ.
I've been caffeinated, so I can go. So I did my undergrad in classics in history and English. So it's like all the sort of things that combine. And I've always been fascinated by the ancient world, but because I think that because I love fantasy, that because there's a lot of confluence between the narrative trajectories of epic fantasy and the larger than life characters of antiquity. So that's part of it, I think. But I know for me, like this gets into the process question as well. When I set out to read, I read a lot of nonfiction as well as fiction. And so my brain is, I guess, just maybe wired for creative writing. Whenever I'm reading about, the poisonous politics of the Julio-Claudians, for example, or I'm reading about the conquest of the Middle East under Alexander, or I'm reading about the conflict between the Persians and the Byzantines and the rise of Islam, I always think about how I can transform that into fantasy, and how I think fantasy can actually ask questions about history as much as it can ask about sort of more metaphysical questions. I think it can also engage with larger philosophical ones about the nature of history, how the actions of the past influence the present and restrict sometimes personal agency. Those are some of the questions that I ask in my fiction, particularly in the epic, the one that's the reimagining of the Roman Byzantine wars. Like, what is it that people can do when confronted with an age-long conflict, and how does a new world come into being? Those are sort of the questions that motivate me, and I find that because we know, or at least think we know, how that has happened in the past, that I find that to be particularly fruitful when I'm engaging with my own creative process.
A lot to chew on there. I don't know, Amanda. I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
I think, why am I drawn to classical mythology? Well, first of all, the characters are fantastic, right? And the problems and things that they get involved in the politics are just riveting to me. And there's a complexity to the characters. It's very, very compelling. But on top of that, there are certain parallels with, I'm looking, and when I'm looking and thinking now of the late Bronze Age, there's certain parallels with our world in terms of it's very global society, a lot of trade, mostly monarchies and in terms of that. So it's a bit different from the way things are today there, but a lot of parallels and yet some very interesting differences that I think make for some, compelling opportunities in fiction. Also, I like the idea that in the ancient past, everything's not materialist, right? You have the natural existence of the supernatural and all that just, has not been quarantined from, society and whatnot. It's just an organic part of the way things are seen. And I find that's a natural fit for our fantasy and what you can do in talking about these other forces and different ways to look at problems, as basic as what caused the Trojan War. The ancients have a very different conception of that from the way contemporary people always want to tie it to, trade and the Dardanelles and this kind of thing. And in the ancient world, they would see it with Helen and Achilles. And, it's a very different way of looking at that and the influence of the gods and the judgment of Paris, that you can get a complexity and a three-dimensionality in terms of these very interesting questions. And it's just a natural fit that allows you to play with politics and religion and magic and great personalities and all at once. So I find the ancient world utterly compelling. It's so familiar and it's so foreign at the same time. And that to me is just catnip. So I guess that would be for me.
Yeah, and actually some of that really resonates with me too, because what I was interested in was getting a 21st century teenager talking to a Bronze Age teenager can actually look at questions. So that what is slavery? Shouldn't the Parthenon marbles go back to Greece? If there wasn't, either they belong to the British or they belong to the Greeks. It's not it to the Bronze Age girl. It's a gift or it's not a gift. There's nothing complex about it. And the similar thing to the 21st century girl, feminism, what's going on? Why do women have to get married? Why are they doing this? Why are they not having careers? And you can ask those questions between those two people from different times in a kind of simple way, but also bringing it to life, I think. So that was something that I was quite interested in. What would be the modern person's perception of Greece, and what would be the Bronze Age, and what would be the Bronze Age perception of the 21st century, and the problems and challenges in both worlds. And the other thing that I was really interested in was that an object can physically take you back, not just in your brain. So you go to a museum and you see a vase painting and that can kind of take you back, but actually what if it really could take you back? So you go to the Louvre Museum and you see a painting that's of the Trojan War and you're there in the Trojan War, and that happens and you can do something to change things. And so that's what I was interested in as well, that the idea of place or object can really take you back to another world, or take you forward. Look in a painting and you're there. It was those kind of things I was interested in as well.
And it's kind of fun, the changes that you can make, and when you're talking about things, I'm having some fun with that too, and little things that might have happened via dramatic license, where you don't change certain big things in the history, but you can go in these interesting alternative stories of what's going on behind the scenes and whatnot. I thought that'd be fun too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that stands out to me, like as I'm listening to both of you speak. And since we're all working in speculative fiction, like broadly conceived, like we're not historical novelists, maybe just slightly adjacent in some cases. So I mean, I don't know you, but one of the things that I find really pleasurable about what maybe we can call historical fantasy, like that's a genre that I feel is coming into its own right now. Like there've been some people who've written in it before, but I feel like it's really kind of experiencing a resurgence of popularity. You see it in things like Circe from Madeline Miller and the sort of the many reinterpretations of Antiquity and the Trojan War in particular that have been coming out in the last couple of years, and where you can extrapolate from the gaps and the lacunae and the myth and sort of twist it and give it just a slight bend to the left, if you will, to make new universes. I find that very pleasurable as a writer to if I'm basing a culture in my fantasy novel on an existing one, I don't feel bound in the same way that historical novelists do. And I find that to be very freeing. Like I love historical fiction and I like to write it sometimes, but I find something much more liberating about writing historical fantasy because I don't have to necessarily obey the rules in the way that, and I don't have to put up with the same kind of persnickety accuracy, pinpointers. Not that anyone here would ever do such a thing, obviously, but there is a tendency in analyses of historical fiction to be very obsessed with accuracy. But if we're writing in speculative fiction, we don't necessarily have that limitation.
I'm so glad you say that because I get all caught up in the historical things, and I went to Akrotiri and Mycenae because I was looking at saying, if I have Clytemnestra wheel around and, what kind of windows do I actually have? What kind of, and have her do these things? What's possible in the Bronze Age, And so I was looking at things. So I want to be as accurate as I can, but there's a lot we don't know too. And so I'm reading all the scholarly articles. I did go to Akrotiri for the known side and then to Mycenae to see what I could glean from being on there. And even things like, can I take a chariot through the Lion Gate? It's like it's just so much fun to have that. I want that in the triumph. So doing things, but yeah, I know you feel a little freed to make some changes with things or to have some fun with it. And I've been doing that too in the speculative fiction. So Minoan revivalist style and artwork, for example. I thought the Mycenaeans should have a little Minoan revivalist with that fun motifs. I think I cut you off, Amanda. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say thank you, and I was just going to say that the next novel I was going to write was going to be more straight historical fiction. So I wanted to write the story of Claudia Metelli from her own point of view, and I was calling it I Claudia, a working title I Claudia. But I've struggled because it's really good that there's not that much that we know. And the reason I wanted to write this, I suppose, because I was annoyed that Nausicaa was underutilized in the Odyssey. I went to a stage production. The RSC did a very good production of Robert Harris's Lustrum, and that Claudia Metelli was such a vamp, and it was just really annoying, and it annoyed me that and so I thought I need to rewrite this person, and so there's enough gaps, but I feel like unless I have some fantasy element in it, I can't do it. And I'm now thinking about body swaps, or who do I bring from the present? I like the present and the past being, talking to each other. And so I'm still thinking about that, but I do want to do something quite different next. So that's going to be what I'm working on, Claudia. But I think I'll struggle with straight historical fiction just because it's not, even with the freedom, it's not as freeing, is it? And you can't have that juxtaposition of the two different thought processes of modern and ancient.
Right. Right. Yeah, different set of rules. So well, and also I believe in the idea of the stories you're meant to write. They come to you. It's sort of, the agathon idea comes through you, and you have to kind of go with the ones that grab you. I love a lot of the things that I've been reading. I love Sarah Ruhl's, play on Eurydice, and I just listened to the opera, that the Met did on her work last weekend. Fantastic, so the Orpheus myth is definitely in my head too, but the stories and then the media, they're going to take that kind of go with what comes through you too, I think.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that too, having been, being fairly recent writing in this way, that you have a problem and then you go to bed and then in the morning, well, of course it's that. So, who are the sirens? Well, of course they're lighthouse keepers. That's what they are. They're just misinterpreted. They're trying to save people. That's what they do. You go to bed with your problem, who are the sirens? You wake up and you know who they are. It's just amazing, that, isn't it? How your subconscious works through the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes like the inspiration hits me, like it'll just be an incidental line and maybe a book I'm reading. Like one of the ideas, because I'm never not without new projects in like 2 or 3 years line. I was reading, she just wrote the new biography of Agrippina. What's her name? I can't. It's it's not important. But she makes an allusion to the idea that the two Julians and Claudians, one of them was divine and was not. Like, obviously the Julians being descended from Venus and the Claudians being more pedestrian and mortal, which gave him the idea to reinterpret the Julio-Claudians as in fact the union that comes about because of a war between gods and humans. And I was like, and I haven't sort of sketched out the actual dramatic arc, but it was just one of those moments where I was like, that would make a really good fantasy story. And it's just amazing how Antiquity just is this constant wellspring of new ideas that can come up to, yes, thank you, Meredith. Emma Southton, yes. Great book, by the way, very irreverent, but a fun take on Agrippina. But even like this, I feel like almost, a philologist, like this tiny little line that I pick out, and that the ideas sort of start to accrue around it, and then I can just sort of sketch that out into a full-fledged story.
Yeah, very true.
So maybe before we open it up to questions from the audience, because we're about halfway through the session, maybe we could just speak a little bit about our process. I think that's something that a lot of non-creative people are, non-creative writers are often interested in, like, well, how do you write? Like, what's your process? So I'm just curious, like, if you had anything that you wanted to speak about in the writing process, either the actual composition, or since you both have different experiences publishing wise, how you went about and chose your methods of either independent or traditional publishing.
Okay, sure. I don't know. Okay, I'll jump in.
You go, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of writing, I think, and I know I think Amanda and you, TJ, too, probably feel there's never enough time. So I find that I write whenever I can in between things. And I have a writer's workshop every Saturday. So, I have to have pages for that. And so that means that it always keeps the scourge at my back, which is good, because when I get tired, I don't want to do it. And that's been very helpful for me, having a writer's group to sort of keep me moving ahead on whatever the current project is.
Right.
Doing that. And because I'm teaching so much now, I do little bits and pieces on the days that have the heavy teaching or grading, components. And I can do little bits, like getting, there's a line of dialogue, or there's an image I want to get, and I get those down, or I'll do some rewriting on things. And then usually Friday is my heavy writing day. I do a little bit every day to keep the story in my head, because otherwise it takes too long to get back into it. So a little bit, but then I do a heavy block on, say, Thursday and Friday usually, and do quite a bit of writing. On the business side, once I had a manuscript, I'm a big proponent of going to conferences and whatnot. So I went to Thriller Fest and Pitch Fest, and I did pitch the story to several agents, and then I sent them, the ones who were interested, you send the manuscript out to them, and they all want different versions, shorter or longer and whatnot. And that process took an additional year and a half or something, back and forth on that. And then I found my agent, Sandy Lou, and went with her, and we went out with the book. And so that got published in the middle of the pandemic, November 2020. So everything was shut down in terms of book signings. I got one book signing in, and then that shut down. So not a great year to be a debut author, but
yeah,
you have to go with what happens. And it was certainly very thematic for my story. So which has a plague in it. So went with that, and then just continuing to write. And my agent now, she has the first book of what I think will be a trilogy of the epic. I'm planning on the epic fantasy being a trilogy with that. So that's how I find, if you're a very busy person, there's no time to procrastinate. So you just don't get writer's block, because you don't have time for it, and you have to keep pushing ahead. Right. So that works for me. That's what I do. And then trying to fit a short story or two in during the year too, because it takes so long to do the novels. I mean, I'm trying to finish one every year, but I think that's very, very hard to do. So
are you going to be one of those trilogy writers that it ends up being 7 or 8 books instead?
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I don't know. The first one wasn't that long. It's not, it's not like George R. R. Martin's, or what's The Wheel of Time, something huge tome. So I love those, but yeah, mine's a little bit more shorter. So we'll see. I think this one will be a trilogy. I may go backwards, and sort of a prehistory sort of origin story or something that way, or go forward in time after that. But yeah, I think in terms of the plotting, I think it will be the 3 books. Well, we'll see. We'll see.
And Beverly, about plotting then, how much do you plot in advance? Because they say you're either a plotter or a pantser, don't you? Or, what are you? Do you go by the seat of your pants, or do you plot it well? Or so Caroline Lawrence, for example, plots it out all really, methodically. I was listening to an interview with Philip Pullman, and he said actually to plot like that is boredom, because you know exactly what's going to happen. And so where would you put yourself on that, planning it all out to just writing by the seat of your pants?
Yeah, well, I think with the first book, I did plot it all out, but then I had to make changes anyway. So then I ended up and, kind of going with some changes. I have to know the peripeteia. I have to know where it starts. I have to know where it should end. And I have to know some of the key bits. And when I worked in film and TV, Stephen Bochco always used to recommend, what are the scenes you really want to see? Mm-hmm. And so I think about those scenes that I really want to see and put them there. And I know how it opens, I know how it ends, and I got to figure out how I get to those, in terms of that. And then these days, I don't plot the whole thing. I did at the beginning, because I thought it's so complex to keep the novel going. I better have thing, but I agree, you take some of the juice out of the writing process when you do that. So I think if you get those key points, then it allows, there's a lot of, twists and turns and a lot of room for innovations that come to you that you can go along and make some big changes. So I'm not a complete seat of the pantser. I can't do that. That would just be, to me, really frightening to look into the abyss that way. I like to have a few goal posts and everything there, but I'm nowadays kind of freeing up the roadmap more than I used to. So I don't know if that.
Yeah,
how about you guys? Yeah.
When I was a fledgling way back when, I did try to outline things, and I too found it very boring and stifling and not particularly useful. And so I have a rare gift that I can write very quickly. Like I'm a fast typer, and I can really sort of churn out lots of pages in a given day.
Oh, I envy that.
which means though that I basically will start out with a germ of an idea and then just sort of write like 5,000 words a day for several days until I just kind of get the broad strokes of what the story is and like what's happening. So I am a seat of the pants person, but it's kind of like outlining, except it's writing the whole thing. And then usually about a fourth of the way through what I would think would be the final manuscript, I'll start all over. And then just with each subsequent draft, if the story becomes clearer. And it's kind of the process I used for my dissertation, and it worked pretty well. So it seems to work pretty well creatively, knock on wood. So I have a co-writer too, and he is how shall I put this? Very ruthless at excising my rhetorical flourishes, shall we say. I can get away with in writing what I get away with in speech. He has a list of banned words I'm not ever allowed to use, so he goes through and cuts them out. I think exquisite is on there. Exquisite is one of my banned words. So
yeah. How about you, Amanda? Do you sort of
yeah? So I think with the 2 books that I've written so far, and the Clody book, assuming if it takes off in a different kind of format, I've had key points that I really needed to get in, and that drove. Well, for the first book, I knew various things that needed to happen, or various monsters that needed to be met, and basically I spent a lot of time looking at, if you're on a fishing boat going around the Mediterranean, how many days would it take you to get from here to there, and that's the island you next go to, and so it was very much these key scenes. So I think, like you were saying, Beverly, I knew where I wanted to get to, and I had these key things to get, and then I found some surprises along the way. And writing Emily's Argonautica, which I'm still tidying up now, that of course I had the whole thing because I was following and changing as I went, Apollonius's Argonautica, and I know that so well now, having rewritten it in a different way, that was probably a little bit, I feel like it's cheating writing, because I had the whole thing, I had the whole structure, but everything changed and was quite different. But it really led me, so I knew what would happen at the end, but yeah, and I knew everywhere they were going to stop, but it completely different thing happened when they stopped. So I guess it's key scenes, but that was a little bit easier because I already had the structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and TJ, you mentioned that you have a writing partner who, helps you with ruthless editing and on. I use my writing group for that. The Saturday, they are both very supportive and ruthless. So I regularly am flayed, because I have my battle with for the same thing, with certain, I guess I would say, bad habits and certain cliches that I'll fall into, and I try to be aware of them. But particularly if I am writing faster, I'm tired, I don't see things in my own writing that you can see in somebody else's. So I find that helps. Do you have somebody who reads your stuff, Amanda, or are you?
Well, I do, but I don't think I've done it well enough. And I think that's part of the problem with the first book that I wrote. When you think it took Madeline Millen 10 years to write Circe, I didn't want to I haven't got 10 years to write this. It's just difficult. And so I had a few readers, some classicists, some non-classicists, who gave me overall, did they enjoy it? What didn't make sense? What could I change? Very high level stuff. And then another friend, classicist, who proofread it for me. But I think in hindsight, before I sent it out to all these agents, I should have done more refining rather than say, right, I've done that now, it's done. I don't think it is really done, and maybe I should go back to it and spend more time on it. And I know now that I'm a better writer in the second book than I was in the first book. So yeah, it would be good to have I suppose it's really good that somebody has helped me, but I guess somebody a more professional. And I've been in writing groups before, but I found that the ones in my local town, they just annoy me so much because they're more about having a cup of tea and a chat. And it's like, I've got 2 hours to do this. I want to write something. That's why I'm coming. I'm too busy to, and it just drives me up the wall, that kind of thing. So to find a more professional writing group, and a lot of people find that they go and do an MA in creative writing. I don't want to spend $5,000 on an MA in creative writing either. And so this is the problem for me, I suppose, that with my writing, my job is I think about left brain, right brain. If I'm doing, my job is, so I've been a project manager for 20 years. I'm now a strategy manager, but basically it's a lot of data and spreadsheets and driving tech delivery. I'm not very techy, but that's my job. So it's very much numbers, get everything into bullet points, PowerPoint, Excel, nothing, no creativity in that way at all. And if I'm all like that, I can't write. And then I find my academic work is somewhere in the middle. It's more creative. And actually I can switch from work brain to academic brain, but I can't switch from work brain to creative writing brain. So I have to have big swathes of time. That's why COVID was so helpful. So really what I could do with this 2 weeks solid writing and get it down there so that I'm not having to switch my brain so much. So that's what I find. It's just so different from the work that I do that it stifles my creativity really, which is a shame. But we all have to pay the bills, don't we? So
that's right. That's right. Yeah. So
I thought what we could do now, since we have about 20 minutes left, is kind of segue into audience questions, because I'm sure that people are burning with questions for us creative types. So Roger, I saw you had a question in the chat box, which I'll ask, and then Meredith has a question. So Roger asks, do you buy into the Joseph Campbell mystique that is the save the cat mindset that extols him?
Wait, the Joseph Campbell I didn't get the last line. I'm sorry, TJ.
Yes. Do we buy into the Joseph Campbell mystique that is that the save the cat mindset that extols him? Or Roger, do you want to elaborate perhaps, and then we can maybe answer?
There's a book I read a few years ago called Save the Cat, which says all you have to do is think like Joseph Campbell. You've already got the story set out for you. Just plug in, put the characters into the right spots. Mm-hmm. Do any of you three panelists extol that approach?
I do, actually. And I'm going to say something that I think some people may find counterintuitive. But I think that our culture fetishizes the subversive and the groundbreaking and all that sort of thing. Like I think a lot about Game of Thrones and the rhetoric surrounding both the show and the books, that it's fantasy for people who don't like fantasy, or it's subverting the epic hero trope and blah, 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 blah. I write genre fantasy because I like genre fantasy and I like knowing what I'm getting into. And I suspect a lot of people read genre because they know what they're getting into. Like, so while I see that there's a place for those kinds of subversive approaches, sometimes I just want to read a traditional Lord of the Rings clone. Like, that's all I want. Like, I don't think that's a bad thing to want or to create. So for me, at least, my stories are still, whether they're erotic or whether they're just kind of like straightforward epics, very much follow the model. And I mean, obviously there's room for growth and wiggle room, but I'm not setting out to write the next like great subversive fantasy novel.
Well, I think the Greek myths are plenty subversive on their own. I mean, George R. R. Martin took quite a bit, it seems to me, the Red Wedding and all these things. It's partly, of course, Scottish history and different things. But I mean, you have the cannibalism, in terms of baking somebody into a pie and all that. That's definitely there in Greek mythology, right? And all of that. So I think there's a lot that goes with that. In terms of structure, yeah, I like both because I find the Greek myths very subversive, but there's also the mythic pattern. And one thing I really like in mythology is what I call the red line idea, that very often you have a character who steps over the red line. It's you do something in a human experience and you are changed forever, right? And the key human experiences that Joseph Campbell was also dealing with, and coming from Jung, in terms of that, there are certain experiences that you have and you are changed forever. And it's whether it's having sex for the first time or having a child or going to war, taking a life, becoming a parent, those are essential human experiences, and mythology is rooted in all of those. And once you cross over, if you've taken a life or if you've become a parent or whatnot, it's a red line. You can't go back. It's like Orpheus. You can't look around, or in terms of that, it's just you're changed. And you oftentimes don't know what the repercussions are going to be until you step over the line, right? And that's part of what fascinates me with a lot of mythology, but the characters and how they respond to these different things once they have those experiences. I find those mythic patterns are very real to me. And that's why I think I find Greek mythology so contemporary, even though, of course, the culture is quite foreign in a lot of ways, but the human dilemmas are evergreen. They are really very similar to things I think we find, at least I see in the contemporary world. So yeah, but in terms of just save the cat though, I mean, the idea of the animals, yeah, I have Achilles talking to his horse Xanthos, and there's definitely a very poignant scene, I hope, in that one when he was talking about film ideas and adapting it that way. It was kind of fun. So sorry.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, what I think about Save the Cat is you have a character, and if they save the cat, then suddenly they're good. And if you do that at the beginning, wonderful. Or if they shot the cat, then they're bad. And I suppose what I was interested in playing with was somebody who seems to be terribly bad. Can they actually be redeemed? Can you ever forgive them for that? If you killed the cat, could you forgive that person? It's much more interesting than you've got the person who saved the cat. They're lovely. I'd much rather have the opposite way. And even if I hate them, can I bring them around to not be hated anymore? And whatever the reason is, they've done something terrible, but they can move on and change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too, because I think that's fascinating. We get into, try and get into the skin of certain characters like Agamemnon. And initially I find readers and people would say, oh, they hate him, but when you're in the chapter written from his point of view and you understand his dilemma and what's going on, it can change your opinion, in terms of that. You start to see things a little bit differently. And I would agree with you, Amanda. There are certain things that, you mentioned Game of Thrones. I mean, the Jaime Lannister character pushes Bran out the tower the very first episode, right? But then you by the end of the series, you understand him very differently. and what's going on with that. And I think mythic characters have that completely three-dimensional quality. There's so much potential for getting into a really complex character, and that's fun.
And it's true of, even like I look at Lord of the Rings, it's, because of course that's the paradigm that everybody in epic fantasy works in to some degree or another. And I think that there's a lazy mode of criticism that says that it's a moral binary in Tolkien's universe, but that's not actually true. Like even Sauron, arguably, and even Morgoth, like arguably the most quote unquote evil characters in epic fantasy are far more complicated and deeply tragic in their own way. So I think there's something deeply like complex about all of epic fantasy. Even those that paint by numbers, I think, have the ability to be, well, let's say complicated in the way that they engage with questions of morality.
Yeah.
Meredith also had a question. What is the role of an editor in your creative production? Do you find editing for creative commercial writing different from editing for scholarly and academic writing? Very good question. I find it somewhat similar in the sense that I am, as both a creative and like scholarly writer, I do have certain turns of phrase and certain weasel words that I tend to lean on. So I don't necessarily use the same part of my brain, but I can sense the same impulses, which is why it's so valuable to have my co-author and editor, because he really helps to rein those in. And so it would be, I don't know, I'd become a better writer and sort of, I've internalized his criticisms, the panopticon. I've kind of like imagined him looking over my shoulder to sort of self-criticize as I'm writing.
Yeah, I need editorial help too, because again, that's one thing I go through the first layer with the writing group, and they try and catch me on things, because again, I just think it's easier to see the flaws in someone else's writing than your own. I find I'm always emotionally closer to it. And it does put on a kind of set of blinders, and I have to try and switch hats and move into the the left brain side. But then it goes through my agent, and she does an editorial, and we're back and forth in that. And then when you go to the publisher, then you have another set, and what I think of as my ongoing battle with the comma, because I like to use them when I want to force breathing, not necessarily when it's grammatically correct, but I want the reader to hear the pauses where I want to put them for a certain effect. And, sometimes I get forced out of that. So we'll do different things. But yeah, and the difference for academic work, mostly I'd say it's in tone, and I have to be careful the way you write. I always think for scholarly and academic work, I always feel like it's armor up, because you have the audience for academic and scholarly work is very, very knowledgeable. And so I feel like the arrows are always going to come, right? Because they know a lot, and they're going to be looking for the flaws and all that. For when you're writing speculative fiction, the audience is a bit different. They want to be taken on that story. And, you will have people, I'm sure, who are going to, be nitpicking and sending the arrows. But in general, it's much more about making things very clear. I think instead of anticipating your own mistakes and where you want to make sure that everything is explicated in a way. When I think of the scholarly writing, I'm always thinking about the objections that are coming. Like, what did I, not explicate and clarify enough. And it's a bit different for a general readership, where it just feels more open. It's a different, and the tone, I have to watch the tone. So don't get too casual in that article. You just write so differently for the two kinds of writing.
Yeah, I agree. It is really different. And having just co-edited a book, I just realized what a bad editor I am. I don't, sorry, Meredith and Dan and others that I've edited. But so, and I do feel on my creative work, I could do with more editing help really than the couple of friends that do it for me now. So I have a friend called Sue, who is also called Rita the Proofreader. And I don't know how she became Rita the Proofreader, but she's been in this for quite a long time. And I wonder, I think maybe somebody objective who I don't know would be better in the way that a copy editor will go through your script when you're submitting an academic book. Somebody who's completely, and I must admit, with my recent public, I didn't agree with the copy editor on a number of things, but they were very obviously very regimented and did a great job. And I think that's what probably I've been missing, is somebody who can do that great job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as I said, I do notice that sometimes my flaws or my shortcomings as a writer of academic stuff tends to creep over into my fantasy too. Like I tend to my paragraphs go on too long. My characters get too involved in themselves. So that's what we have editors for. So we have another question. How do you deal with gaps in mythological material? Since many mythical characters are very well grounded in surviving materials, is it hard to make characters we know less about just as compelling?
I think it can be very freeing, sometimes, depending on where they're coming in the story. Are they a supporting character, or are you going to take them and make them more of a protagonist or something? It can be very, very freeing. But I look at the way the 5th century authors would take the Bronze Age myths, and, obviously they're shaping them for their time and shaping the characters and the kinds of underlying questions, something like the Oresteia, where you want to legitimize the court system that comes in, and you're dealing with a very foreign culture at that point, the great Mycenaean, kingdoms basically that are gone. Those palatial kingdoms are gone, and so they'll reconfigure it. And I think in the same way with certain characters, you know a lot about some, and then again, there's a lot you don't know. So there's some wiggle room, and then there are some characters who are very thinly drawn in the surviving literature. There may have been more that, because of course we've lost so much in terms of that. But I find that can be kind of freeing, because I personally don't think people have changed that much. Technology changes enormously, and that has an effect on people. But I think the essential human dilemmas are still there. It's just how you deal with the problems in a given society that shapes you. So.
Yeah, I found it really interesting when rewriting the Argonautica, that there are so episodic. There are so many characters that just pop in and out again, and that was too much. So I had to concentrate on a few, and so a couple of the characters that really are not very well rounded in the Argonautica, I had to make them more real. And so we had the prince who was in love with an Amazon who joins the Argonauts, or there's the very young shy Kitisaurus who becomes a friend who doesn't really like betraying his family, and so those minor characters, actually you get rid of a lot of them because there's just too many names, and then you really concentrate on these minor ones and think about what they might be like and how they might interact with the female character. So how do we make them interesting and but cut them down too? So there's like 10 people that we know. We don't want to know 50 people because we couldn't. And certainly in the Argonautica, we probably don't know many of them at all. They're just a name that comes in and goes out again. So that was the freeing thing, is take the ones that you think could be interesting and make them interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I find that to be true. Like, even with historical characters, like, I don't know, maybe like the Severan dynasty of Rome, like they're not as well documented, say, as the Julio-Claudians, but I find them to be endlessly fascinating for that reason. Like, we don't know a ton about the Julias, like Domna and Maesa and all that, but because of the gaps, we can make up what we don't know. If we're writing in speculative fiction land, we can do whatever we want. And I think that's part of what makes it exciting, is to be able to elaborate. And it's kind of like, I mean, to go back to Tolkien, that's basically what he was doing with a lot of his work, was finding those gaps in lacunae and using his own imagination to sketch them out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have time for a final question, which is about students. So let's see. In your teaching and other work with non-academics, how do or have you used creative writing to engage students and other non-specialists in learning and exploring ancient material?
Oh yeah. Well, I'm this term, for example, I'm teaching 4 classical mythology courses, and so there's a lot of opportunity for that. I always include videos, and then the first class, if it's in person, I usually have a clip from something like the Hunger Games or something like that, because the students know that. And then, talk a little bit about how they're going to see that the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur is really the underlying structure for this story that then turns into a kind of Spartacus by the 3rd book of her series, that kind of thing. So they come in contemporary reworkings of things come in all the time. And I give extra credit options, for film viewing and dealing with how is this particular writer or filmmaker taken a given myth and reshaped it for a contemporary audience. So there are things, options like that, both film and novel. And, I haven't had any takers on the operas, but that's a possibility, and things too. Lots of different ways of reimagining classical mythology. And we're swimming in a sea of it. I took a little photo and put up on Twitter. They had the Odyssey coffee from Starbucks and the sirens. It's everywhere. The stuff, once you have your eyes open, and film companies from Zeus to, what is the one, TG one where it has Odysseus, with the bow that goes through the axis. You know the one I mean. Yeah. Right. The logo. I can see it. I forget the company, but it's just everywhere. So I think there are lots of opportunities, and, I'll always be bringing in PowerPoints to show some of those and get them, so they just notice where these sometimes casual references are, and then the deeper ones that just flood through our popular culture, So, and students like that, because I find the popular culture, and that includes my own work, can be a bridge to the Iliad and the Odyssey, and to the great, tragedians and whatnot, that may be a little bit daunting to people. They don't see it initially as speaking to them, but, they get into it by this other material, and then they do come to love it, and that kind of thing. So I think the old works will speak to anybody who really engages with them.
That is my hope when I draw an antiquity for my stories and cultures and so forth, that people, if they ask me and I tell them like it's rooted in, in the real world, that I think that it helps to, as you put it, Beverly, like make a bridge to the public. And as I've said in my professional, scholarly life, I think that's really important to help the general public understand just how ubiquitous antiquity is in their fictions and the way they make sense of the world and how they think about history. I think that in fiction is really important as a means of doing that, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And, I have over the time, I'd say, it used to be there would be more students who would come in and they would have read the Odyssey, at least, maybe not the Iliad, but they would have read the Odyssey or something before coming to class. Nowadays, I find it's very rare to have a student who's read that, but they will know something like Percy Jackson. Mm-hmm. And so, it's a starting place. So we'll start with Percy Jackson and how, Perseus is the son of Zeus, not Poseidon, and, get into it. And that leads into, the actual ancient sources of the myths that we have. And, as an adult reader, then you have a different level of complexity that the story opens up, and the things that you loved as a kid, then they open up into this wonderful, rich environment, that you have available to you now as an adult. So I find students really do respond to that. And the whole idea of reception studies is very important, I think.
Yeah.
So just wanting to, because we're nearing the end, so and I've done a number of Greek mythology based creative writing workshops for the public, which have gone down really well, and I think people always are able to the stories resonate with them so that they can take those characters forward as they have with us. So I think that's brilliant. And so now I just want to have a little bit of a plug if you haven't already seen it. So Natalie Swain and I have proposed a fan fiction writing call for part of this conference, and so I think that Meredith has just put it out, the details on it, and we're just looking for short pieces of fan fiction and fan fiction in the broadest sense. So I would class fan fiction as if I was a fan of I suppose, if I was a fan of a myth, like Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles is Achilles fan fiction, so it doesn't have to be fan fiction of a television program. I will give you a spoiler of what I've written, only about 100 words of so far. So I'm looking at Doctor Who and the Weeping Angels, and the Doctor and Yaz go back in time to find a naked statue of Aphrodite, which actually turns out to be a weeping angel. So I've got that to write, but if I can get the time to finish it off. And so any type of fan fiction is fine, whether it's ancient world fan fiction, television, games, film, whatever you'd like to do, just with some links to the ancient world. Would love to see everybody's creative writing, and the aim is then to share that with the group. So please, submit by the 1st of January, Meredith tells us. I'd forgotten when the date was, so I'm gonna have to get writing, aren't I, really, over Christmas. So while you're having your Christmas turkey and you're just thinking, what am I going to do this afternoon between this on TV and being full of whatever. I know in the States you don't have Christmas pudding so much as we do, but when you've got that 2 hours of hiatus, then sit down and write some fan fiction.
Yeah, and if you want to read more about it, it's on the AIMS website. If you go into the news tab, you'll see it in the drop down menu. So it's literally fan fiction CFP, so very clearly labeled.
Fun.
This is great. I thought this was an excellent roundtable. It's, as I said, it's always exciting to connect with new creative folks, and hopefully we can continue these connections. I think it's really important, and that we spread the word about how ubiquitous Antiquity is and how much it continues to inspire us. So I think that's all for all I have. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for moderating, TJ and Amanda. It's just so delightful to meet you,
Yeah, lovely.
But I'll get to England again soon, I hope, and have to look you up.
Yeah, no, that would be brilliant. And thanks, TJ, for organising. It's been great. And yes, I will be in touch again, Beverly. It'd be lovely to talk again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank Meredith. She is the one who asked me to do this. So
okay. Well, Meredith is the what can I say? So Meredith's the principal of all this joyousness that we're having for the next few days. So the goddess of aims. Maybe we should call her that.
She's our guest. She's our princess, our princess. She is our
Big news, Meredith. Thank you so much.